Imagine this. You are Marie de Toulouse, 23 years old, kneeling on cold stone in a windowless chamber beneath Carcassonne's cathedral in the year 1342. Your wrists are bound behind your back with rope that cuts into your skin. The Inquisitor, Bernard Gui, stands before you in black robes, his face expressionless as he holds up a metal device shaped like a pear. 4 blunt petals gleam in the torchlight. Your breath comes in short gasps as you realize this object is meant to enter your body. What happens next will destroy you in ways that make death seem merciful. This is not fiction. This is documented history from the torture chambers where the Catholic Church systematically destroyed heretics through methods specifically designed to violate the most intimate parts of their bodies. The chamber smells of damp stone and old blood. Sweat runs down your spine despite the underground chill. 2 guards force you onto a wooden bench, spreading your legs and binding your ankles to iron rings embedded in the floor. Bernard Gui approaches slowly, turning the pear-shaped device in his hands. He explains in a clinical voice that this instrument will expand inside you until your flesh tears. The screams will prove your guilt or your innocence. Either way, you will never be whole again. The theological justification is simple. Your body housed heretical thoughts. Your body must be punished where the sin originated. For women accused of Catharism, that meant sexual organs. For men, the same device entered through the mouth or rectum. The Church had perfected the geography of human suffering. The pear of Anguish was not a random torture device dreamed up by sadistic minds. It was a carefully designed instrument documented in inquisitorial manuals and torture chamber inventories across medieval Europe. Bernard Gui's Practica Inquisitionis from 1323 describes various instruments for extracting confessions from heretics, though he uses euphemistic language that barely conceals the horror. The device itself consisted of 4 metal segments that could be gradually expanded by turning a screw mechanism at the base. When inserted into a vagina, anus, or mouth, the expanding segments would tear tissue, rupture internal organs, and cause hemorrhaging that often proved fatal. The torture was deliberate and methodical. Inquisitors would expand the device slowly, allowing victims to feel each incremental increase in agony. They would pause at intervals to ask questions about heretical beliefs or demand names of other heretics. If the victim fainted from pain, they would be revived and the process would continue. The psychological dimension was as brutal as the physical violation. Marie de Toulouse would have known exactly what was coming. The Inquisitors made sure victims understood every detail of their upcoming torture. They displayed the instruments on tables. They explained how each device worked. They described previous victims' reactions in clinical detail. This advanced knowledge served a dual purpose. It encouraged confession before torture began, and it maximized the terror of those who refused to confess. The waiting period could last days while victims were kept in cells adjacent to torture chambers, hearing the screams of others undergoing the same procedures they would soon experience. The stench of blood and human waste permeated these underground spaces. Guards would deliberately walk past cells with blood-stained instruments, making sure prisoners saw what awaited them. But here's where the horror escalates beyond individual torture into systematic practice. The Inquisition maintained detailed records of which torture methods proved most effective for extracting confessions from different categories of heretics. Women suspected of Catharism received genital-focused torture because Cathar theology emphasized spiritual equality between sexes. The Inquisition's response was to demonstrate male dominance through sexual violation. Men accused of Waldensian heresy underwent rectal torture because Waldensians questioned church authority. The Inquisition literally sodomized them with metal instruments as punishment for theological sodomy. The logic was twisted but consistent. Every heretical belief had a corresponding torture designed to destroy the body part associated with that sin. Heretics who preached false doctrine had their tongues pierced or removed. Those who read forbidden texts had their eyes burned, and those whose sexuality was deemed corrupted by heretical beliefs had their genitals systematically destroyed. The documentation of these practices comes from multiple sources that survived despite church efforts to suppress evidence. Bernard Gui's manual was not unique. Nicolau Eimerich's Directorium Inquisitorum from 1376 provided even more explicit instructions for torturing heretics. Secular authorities like the French crown and various German principalities maintained their own torture records. Archaeological excavations of former Inquisition prisons in Carcassonne, Toulouse, and Albi have uncovered the actual chambers where these tortures occurred. Stone benches with iron restraints remain bolted to walls. Drainage channels carved into floors carried away blood and other fluids. The physical evidence matches the documentary record with horrifying precision. These were not isolated incidents. They were standard operating procedures applied across centuries and continents wherever the Inquisition operated. Marie de Toulouse's actual fate was recorded in fragmentary Inquisition documents that survived in Toulouse archives. She was accused of being a perfecta, a female spiritual leader in the Cathar movement. The charges against her included preaching heretical doctrine, administering Cathar sacraments, and corrupting other women through false teachings. Her interrogation began with standard questioning but quickly escalated when she refused to recant. The inquisitors ordered her subjected to the pear of Anguish. The torture session lasted 3 hours. She confessed to heresy and provided names of 17 other Cathars before losing consciousness from blood loss. She died 2 days later from internal injuries and infection. Her body was burned anyway as a convicted heretic. The Inquisition recorded her confession as evidence of successful interrogation technique and moved on to the next suspect. The transition from isolated torture to systematic sexual violence occurred gradually but deliberately. By the late 15th century, the Inquisition had developed sophisticated protocols for torturing suspected heretics based on their gender and the specific heresies they allegedly practiced. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487 marked a significant escalation. This manual, written by German inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, provided explicit instructions for torturing women accused of witchcraft and heresy. The authors argued that women's sexuality made them particularly susceptible to heretical corruption. Therefore, torture should focus on destroying that sexuality. The breast ripper, another documented device, consisted of 4 clawed prongs heated red-hot and used to tear apart women's breasts. The heretic's fork, a shorter instrument with sharp points on both ends, was strapped between a victim's chin and sternum, forcing the head into an agonizing backward position that prevented speech. These devices were often used in combination. Anna Hoffman and Elisabeth Weber faced this combined torture in Cologne in 1487, the same year the Malleus Maleficarum was published. Both women were accused of being witches who had made pacts with demons and engaged in heretical sexual practices during Sabbath gatherings. The charges were fabricated, based on testimony extracted through torture from other accused women. But once accused, Anna and Elisabeth faced a judicial process designed to guarantee conviction. They were stripped naked and examined by female inspectors searching for devil's marks, any birthmark, scar, or skin imperfection that could be interpreted as proof of demonic contact. The inspection itself was a form of sexual assault, conducted by women who knew that finding marks meant reward money. Every suspect was found to have marks. The torture began immediately after the inspection. Anna Hoffman was subjected to the breast ripper first. 4 guards held her down while the inquisitor heated the claws in a brazier until they glowed. The device was applied cold initially, the claws penetrating her skin and clamping onto breast tissue. Then the heated version was used, searing flesh as it tore. The smell of burning human tissue filled the chamber. Anna screamed until her voice gave out. She confessed to flying to Sabbath gatherings on a broomstick, having intercourse with demons and cursing her neighbors' livestock. Every word was a lie, but the confession stopped the torture temporarily. Elisabeth Weber, forced to watch Anna's torture while awaiting her own, began confessing before the instruments touched her body. She admitted to the same crimes Anna had confessed to, adding elaborate details about demon lovers and heretical rituals. Her confession didn't save her from torture. The Inquisitors applied the heretic's fork, forcing her head back until vertebrae cracked. They wanted more names. Elisabeth provided 17 names of women she claimed attended Sabbath gatherings with her. Most were enemies or rivals. Some were women who had slighted her years earlier. All would be arrested based on her testimony. The theological justification for genital-focused torture became increasingly explicit in inquisitorial writings. The argument went like this. Heresy was spiritual fornication with demons and false doctrine. Physical fornication organs must be destroyed to prevent spiritual corruption from spreading. Women's bodies, already seen as weaker vessels prone to sin, required particularly aggressive purification. Men's bodies needed similar treatment when corrupted by sodomy, which was conflated with heresy in medieval theology. The punishment had to fit the sin geographically. If your genitals enabled heretical acts, your genitals would be destroyed. The Church was saving your soul by destroying your body. This logic appears insane to modern minds, but it represented mainstream theological thinking in the medieval period. The most respected theologians, the most educated inquisitors, the most powerful bishops all agreed that torturing heretics' sexual organs was not merely justified but required by divine law. What you've witnessed so far reveals the systematic nature of sexual torture in medieval heresy prosecution. The devices, the procedures, the theological justifications, all carefully documented and refined over centuries. If exploring these buried truths about how religious authorities weaponized sexual violence resonates with your curiosity about the real human experience hidden behind sanitized history, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into the archives they tried to destroy. The stories waiting ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about the medieval church's crusade against heresy. You're about to discover something that will fundamentally alter your understanding of how power operates through sexual violence disguised as religious duty. The Spanish Inquisition took these torture methods to even more systematic extremes during the 16th century. Isabella Ramirez, a converso woman accused of secretly practicing Judaism in Toledo in 1523, faced torture protocols specifically designed for suspected crypto-Jews. The Spanish Inquisition maintained that Jewish heretics were particularly sexually corrupted, requiring the most severe genital torture to purify their souls. Isabella's interrogation began with standard questioning about her religious practices. Did she light candles on Friday evenings? Did she change her linens on Saturdays? Did she avoid pork? These mundane domestic activities became evidence of heretical Jewish practice. When Isabella denied the charges, the Inquisitors ordered her stripped and examined for signs of circumcision, a bizarre procedure applied to women based on the false belief that Jewish women underwent some form of genital cutting. No such practice existed, but the examination provided an excuse for invasive sexual assault, masquerading as investigation. The Judas cradle awaited Isabella in the torture chamber beneath Toledo's Inquisition headquarters. This device consisted of a pyramid-shaped seat mounted on a sturdy wooden frame. The victim would be suspended above the pyramid point by ropes attached to a pulley system, then slowly lowered until the point penetrated the vagina or anus. The torturer controlled the descent rate, determining how quickly the point would tear through internal tissue. The pyramid could also be heated, adding burning to the tearing. Guards would sometimes shake the ropes, causing the victim to bounce on the point and accelerate the internal damage. The torture could last hours or even days if the victim was repeatedly raised and lowered. Death from septic shock or hemorrhaging was common. Survival meant permanent internal injuries that caused chronic pain and often made normal elimination impossible. The psychological trauma was equally permanent for those who lived through it. Isabella Ramirez endured 3 sessions on the Judas cradle over a 2-week period. Between sessions, she was kept in a cell without medical care, allowing infections to develop. The Inquisitors believed that untreated injuries increased the victim's suffering and made subsequent torture sessions more effective. Isabella's first confession came after the second session. She admitted to secretly observing Jewish Sabbath, eating kosher food, and teaching her daughters Hebrew prayers. The confession was entirely false, extracted through unbearable agony. But it wasn't enough. The Inquisitors demanded names of other crypto-Jews. Isabella provided 17 names, most of people she barely knew. She would have named anyone to stop the torture. The third session on the Judas cradle ruptured her internally. She died 5 days later from infection, never seeing her daughters again. Her property was confiscated by the Inquisition. Her daughters were placed in Catholic convents. Her false confession was recorded as proof of Jewish heresy and used to justify further prosecutions. The documentation of Isabella's torture comes from Spanish Inquisition trial records preserved in the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid. These records, kept secret for centuries, reveal the systematic nature of genital torture applied to converso women. The Inquisitors maintained detailed logs of which torture methods proved most effective for extracting confessions from different categories of suspects. Women accused of crypto-Judaism received the Judas cradle. Women accused of Protestantism faced different protocols. The torture was customized to match the alleged heresy, creating a taxonomy of sexual violence mapped onto theological categories. The records include sketches of torture devices, descriptions of procedures, and notes on victims' responses. Some entries record how long victims screamed before confessing. Others note which body positions maximized suffering. The clinical detachment with which Inquisitors documented human agony is perhaps more disturbing than the torture itself. But the escalation doesn't stop with devices and individual tortures. The Inquisition also employed systematic rape as a purification method, particularly during the French Wars of Religion in the late 16th century. This practice lacked the bureaucratic documentation of formal torture protocols, but extensive evidence appears in Protestant martyrologies and survivor testimonies. Catholic forces, blessed by Inquisition authorities, would raid Huguenot communities and subject Protestant women to gang rape as punishment for heresy. The theological justification was that Protestant women had corrupted themselves through false doctrine and required purification through Catholic male seed. This wasn't random wartime sexual violence. It was organized, sanctioned, and theologically rationalized as a tool of religious persecution. The perpetrators believed they were performing a holy act by violating heretic women. The Siege of Toulouse in 1562 provides documented examples of this systematic sexual violence. Catholic forces, supported by Inquisition representatives, captured the Protestant-held city after a 3-month siege. What followed was not merely military occupation, but religiously motivated mass rape. Protestant women were dragged from their homes and violated in streets, churches, and public squares. Priests blessed the soldiers before these assaults. Inquisition observers documented which women were raped, recording their names and the charges of heresy against them. The rapes were treated as acts of religious purification, not criminal assault. Women who survived often found themselves pregnant with their attackers' children. The Church then claimed these pregnancies proved the women had consented, absolving the rapists and adding the crime of fornication to the women's heresy charges. The theological gymnastics required to justify this horror were elaborate but internally consistent within medieval Catholic doctrine. Marie Durand, a Huguenot woman from Toulouse, left a testimony describing her experience during the 1562 occupation. She was 31 years old, married with 3 children. Catholic soldiers broke into her home, killed her husband when he tried to protect her, and dragged her to the cathedral square. There, in full view of neighbors and Inquisition officials, 5 soldiers raped her repeatedly over several hours. A priest stood nearby, occasionally sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers of purification. When Marie tried to resist, the soldiers beat her and threatened to kill her children. After the assault, she was arrested for heresy based on her Protestant faith. The rape was entered into the record as evidence that she had seduced Catholic men, proving her heretical nature. She was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in the Tower of Constance. She spent 38 years in that prison, finally released in 1768 as an elderly woman. Her testimony, preserved in Protestant martyrology collections, describes not only her physical violation, but the theological framework Catholic authorities used to justify it. The systematic nature of this sexual violence appears in multiple sources. Jean Crespin's massive martyrology, published in various editions from 1554 onward, documents hundreds of cases of Protestant women raped by Catholic forces with Inquisition approval. Catholic sources acknowledge these events but describe them as necessary measures to combat heresy. The disconnect is staggering. Protestant sources describe brutal sexual assault. Catholic sources describe religious purification. Both agree on the basic facts. Women were sexually violated by Catholic forces in the context of religious persecution. They simply frame the same events through incompatible moral lenses. The modern reader recognizes this as systematic sexual violence used as a weapon of religious terror. The historical participants saw it as spiritual warfare where women's bodies were the battlefield. The public dimension of heretic torture reached its peak in the witch trials of the early 17th century. Veronika Zerich, accused of witchcraft in Bamberg in 1610, faced torture that combined sexual humiliation with public execution in ways designed to maximize both physical suffering and social degradation. The Bamberg witch trials were among the most extensive in German history, resulting in over 600 executions between 1626 and 1631. But the torture protocols developed during this period had been refined over previous decades. Veronika's trial came during the early phase when inquisitors were still experimenting with methods to break accused witches. The charges against her included making a pact with the devil, attending Sabbath gatherings, and causing storms through witchcraft. The evidence consisted of testimony from other tortured women who had named her to stop their own suffering. Veronika's torture began with stripping and examination for devil's marks. The search was performed by male examiners who penetrated every orifice searching for hidden marks. The examination itself was sexual assault, but it was recorded in trial documents as necessary investigation. After marks were inevitably found, Veronika was subjected to strappado, a torture where victims were suspended by ropes tied to their wrists behind their backs, dislocating shoulders. Between strappado sessions, she faced sexual torture specifically designed to extract confessions of sexual congress with demons. Examiners inserted heated metal rods into her vagina while demanding she describe her encounters with the devil. They applied thumbscrews to her nipples while asking about nursing demon familiars. The torture was methodical and prolonged, designed to break her psychologically while destroying her body. After 3 days of torture, Veronika confessed to everything. She admitted to having sex with the devil every Saturday night for 7 years. She described flying to Sabbath gatherings and participating in infanticide and cannibalism. She provided names of 37 other women who attended these gatherings. Every word was false, extracted through unbearable torment. But the confession triggered her execution protocol. Veronika was sentenced to be broken on the wheel, an execution method where the victim's limbs were systematically shattered with an iron bar while they were tied to a large wooden wheel. But Bamberg's execution protocols added a sexual dimension. Before the breaking began, Veronika was stripped naked and displayed to the assembled crowd. Her breasts and genitals were mutilated with hot pincers as the executioner announced her sexual crimes. The crowd was encouraged to jeer and throw excrement. Only then did the actual breaking begin, each bone methodically shattered while she remained conscious. The torture lasted over 2 hours. Veronica was still alive when her broken body was finally placed on display, rotting on the wheel as a warning to other potential witches. The Bamberg trial records preserved in the city archives include detailed descriptions of her torture and execution, complete with notations about crowd reactions and theological commentary from presiding officials. Friedrich Werner, the Suffragan bishop who oversaw many Bamberg witch trials, gave sermons praising the public torture of heretic women as necessary theater that demonstrated God's justice. He specifically argued that sexual torture and humiliation of female heretics served an educational function, showing the community what happened to women who rejected proper Christian sexual morality. The torture wasn't merely punishment, it was propaganda, carefully staged to reinforce church authority and terrorize potential dissenters. The breaking wheel with sexual elements became a standard execution method for female heretics and witches across German territories during the early 17th century. The public nature was essential. These executions occurred in market squares and town centers on market days when maximum crowds could witness them. Authorities required citizens to attend, sometimes fining those who stayed home. Children were brought to watch, theoretically learning moral lessons about the consequences of heresy. The spectacle combined religious instruction with entertainment. Vendors sold food and drink. Musicians sometimes played. The atmosphere mixed carnival with atrocity, normalizing extreme violence against women's bodies. The sexuality of the torture was explicit and intentional. Executioners would pause the breaking to penetrate victims with heated implements while explaining that this was punishment for sexual relations with demons. The crowd's participation, jeering, throwing objects, making sexual comments, turned individual torture into communal violence. The long-term psychological impact on survivors of heretic torture created lasting trauma that medical historians are only now beginning to understand through analysis of historical records. Women who survived torture often lived with chronic pain from internal injuries, PTSD symptoms described in contemporary documents as melancholia or religious despair, and social ostracism that made normal life impossible. Many survivors sought refuge in convents, not from religious devotion, but because convents were the only institutions that would accept permanently damaged women. Others lived as beggars or died by suicide. The rate of suicide among torture survivors was high enough that church authorities issued specific theological rulings on whether tortured heretics who killed themselves could receive Christian burial. The consensus was no. Suicide proved they had remained under demonic influence, validating the original torture. The generational trauma extended to victims' families. Children witnessed their mothers tortured and executed. Husbands watched wives violated by inquisitors. Communities internalized the message that sexual torture was an appropriate response to religious dissent. The normalization of this violence shaped European culture for centuries. The witch trials eventually declined, but the precedent that religious authorities could employ sexual torture against heretics established patterns that persisted into the modern era. The Inquisition's methods influenced colonial violence, where indigenous peoples accused of heresy faced similar tortures. The protocols influenced secular torture during political persecutions. The underlying logic, that enemies of the state or church could be sexually violated with impunity, never truly disappeared. You came into this investigation thinking you understood medieval torture. Now you leave understanding that the Inquisition developed systematic sexual violence protocols as sophisticated as any modern horror. This transformation of perspective is exactly why these buried histories matter. If this journey into archived testimony of institutionalized sexual terror has awakened your appetite for truth, that powerful institutions tried to destroy, subscribing means you'll continue accessing revelations that sanitized history refuses to acknowledge. Your curiosity about how power really operates through sexual violence deserves documentation. While others believe the sanitized medieval narrative, you'll know what actually happened in those underground chambers. The documentation of medieval sexual torture against heretics exists across hundreds of archives throughout Europe. Inquisition, trial records, torture chamber inventories, executioners' diaries, theological treatises justifying these methods, survivor testimonies, and archaeological remains all corroborate the same horrifying conclusion. The Catholic Church, along with Protestant authorities who adopted identical methods, systematically employed sexual torture as a primary tool for suppressing religious dissent. The scale was massive, hundreds of thousands of victims over 5 centuries. The methods were refined and standardized through manuals distributed across Europe. The theological justifications were debated and formalized by the era's greatest minds. This wasn't peripheral to medieval Christianity. It was central to how religious authority maintained power through terror focused on human sexuality. The modern Church has never formally acknowledged this history. There have been vague apologies for excesses during the Inquisition, but no specific recognition of systematic sexual torture. The archives remain largely closed to researchers. When documents do emerge, they're often heavily redacted. The institutional memory has been carefully suppressed, creating a sanitized version of medieval Christianity that omits the torture chambers beneath every cathedral. But the evidence survives despite suppression efforts. Historians have pieced together the full horror through fragments preserved in secular archives, Protestant martyrologies that documented Catholic torture, and archaeological excavations that revealed the physical spaces where these atrocities occurred. The legacy of medieval sexual torture shapes modern religious authority in ways rarely acknowledged. The Vatican's current opposition to reproductive rights, its treatment of sexual abuse scandals, its theology around sexuality and sin, all these connect back to medieval precedents established through torture chambers. The underlying logic hasn't changed. Church authorities still claim ultimate authority over human sexuality. They still condemn those who dissent as corrupted and dangerous. They've simply lost the state power to enforce their positions through physical torture. The theological framework that justified destroying heretics' genitals persists in doctrines condemning sexual autonomy, reproductive freedom, and gender identity. The tools have changed. The power structure remains. Understanding this history matters because it reveals how religious institutions use sexual control as their primary mechanism of social power. The medieval Church couldn't allow heretics to live because heretical sexuality, the idea that human bodies and desires existed outside Church control, threatened the entire power structure. Torturing heretics' sexual organs wasn't sadism. It was systematic enforcement of sexual monopoly. The Church claimed exclusive authority to define proper sexuality, proper gender, proper use of bodies. Anyone who challenged that claim faced torture designed to destroy the body parts that enabled their dissent. This pattern repeats throughout history whenever authoritarian systems, religious or secular, seek total control over populations. Sexual torture becomes the enforcement mechanism because sexuality is the most intimate frontier of human autonomy. The victims of medieval sexual torture deserve remembrance not as abstract historical figures, but as real people who suffered unimaginable violation. Marie de Toulouse, Anna Hoffman, Elisabeth Weber, Isabella Ramirez, Marie Durand, Veronica Zerich, and hundreds of thousands of others whose names were never recorded. They were tortured not for genuine crimes, but for threatening religious authorities' monopoly on sexuality and belief. Their suffering was deliberate, systematic, and sanctioned by the most powerful institution in European history. The Church that tortured them still exists, still claims moral authority, still shapes policy affecting billions of people's sexual and reproductive lives. The connection between medieval torture chambers and modern religious politics over sexuality is direct and unbroken. The final revelation is this: sexual torture of heretics wasn't medieval barbarism that modern civilization has transcended. It was a deliberate system of control that established patterns still operating today. The tools have become more subtle, psychological rather than physical, legal rather than directly violent. But the underlying goal remains identical, controlling human sexuality as the foundation of social control. Every battle over reproductive rights, sexual autonomy, or gender identity connects back to that medieval torture chamber. Every religious authority claiming the right to define proper sexuality stands in the lineage of those inquisitors heating iron devices in braziers. Understanding this history isn't about condemning the past. It's about recognizing the present. The archives containing this evidence exist. The torture devices survive in museums. The trial. Would you have protested? Would you have risked your own body in those torture chambers by defending heretics? Or would you have participated in the system, attending public executions and throwing excrement at naked, tortured women while priests blessed the spectacle? Most people prefer to believe they would have been heroes. History suggests otherwise. The torture of heretics was normalized, sanctioned, celebrated. Good Christians attended executions. Devout believers staffed torture chambers. The most educated theologians wrote manuals justifying these methods. Evil doesn't require monsters. It requires normal people accepting systematic violence as necessary and proper. Medieval sexual torture teaches us how easily humans rationalize atrocity when authority provides theological cover and social pressure rewards compliance. This knowledge changes you. You can